So this lesson is going to just teach you about writing a perfect essay. It's just a real kind of quick introduction to essay writing, but it's also going to give you the kind of benchmark that you need to be aiming for when you're writing your essays. And I've kind of centered it around English literature essays, but you also have to write essays for English language and any other humanities subject like sociology or history. So all the stuff that you learn in this lesson is applicable to all of those essay-based subjects. So we're going to break it down into 4 categories: keywords, introduction, middle paragraphs, and conclusion. And we're going to just quickly go through what those are and then how understanding what you do in each one makes your essay better. So the first thing is keywords. If you're not sure what keywords are, they're basically just like the most important words in your question. So every essay question or every exam question that you're given will have kind of like a sentence or 2 sentences that is your question, but within that there might be 3 or 4 really important words that you have to properly grapple with and understand in order to write your answer. So I've kind of just made up 3 questions here for the sake of exploring keywords. I want you to just have a think about that first one. In what ways does the writer explore the idea of growing up? What is your kind of gut feeling about the keywords in that question? Partly with keywords, it's just kind of, you need to kind of practice a lot of seeing different questions, finding the keywords of each question, and then you get a feeling for it and you develop a kind of sensitivity to the most important words within a certain essay question. So yeah, I'd like you to just have a little think about what you think the most important words are there, and then I'll kind of highlight them for you. So for me, the most important words are what ways, writer, an idea of growing up, or even maybe just growing up. So hopefully you got something similar to that. Doesn't matter if you just got ways or if you put the writer instead of writer, but hopefully you've got those as kind of basic ideas in that first question. All of the keywords in the question actually kind of point you towards answering in a certain way. So if you miss keywords, you kind of miss part of your answer out, and then you'd write a not as strong essay as you should be writing. So you want to just make sure that you can write, you can identify the keywords so that you can write kind of a full answer on the essay. So what ways kind of points us towards, I'll kind of write it out actually. So ways, that word, means it's a discursive essay. You need to discuss a big topic and break it into smaller parts. So each paragraph would be a different way. So the topic of each paragraph needs to be a different way. Writer means you need to focus on techniques that the writer uses, and also kind of intentions, like what do they intend by their text? What are they kind of wanting us to really think or feel or realize as a result of reading whatever it is that we're reading? So the message and the motivation behind the writer is really important for getting a kind of really good focus to your essay and making sure all of your individual points tie together into a coherent whole. Finally, idea of growing up. Probably you could shorten that to growing up, to be honest. That's just your focus. That's your focal point. So everything that you write has to be about growing up. It has to be about what the writer's kind of saying about growing up, and you have to split that into smaller paragraphs that explore different ways in which the writer approaches the idea of growing up. So that's kind of an introduction to the keywords of that question. I've got two more here. The third one, I deliberately made it a little bit tougher for anyone that's studying A-level or university level. So if you get to the third one and you find it a little bit harder, that's why it is actually a slightly more difficult type of question. I want you to just kind of pause for a second and have a go at trying to find the keywords in both of these questions here. While you do that, I'll kind of highlight what I would have said was the main keywords in each one. So hopefully you got something a little bit like this. The second question is reasonably straightforward and quite similar to the first. Compare two sources and parenting are the key ideas. You might have got ideas about parenting rather than just parenting. What that means is it's comparative, so you have to compare and contrast the whole way through. Ideally, you would want a comparative structure there as well that helps you make those comparisons and contrast points. Two sources means you have to deal with two things equally, so two texts, two sources. It might say source A, source B, something like that. Whenever you've got more than one thing that you're looking at in your question, you need an equal focus, because if you look at one in detail and the other one you kind of just touch on it, you're never going to get those top marks. It's not going to be a perfect essay. And in this case, we've got parenting as a theme or a focus, a focal point of the question. So what that means is you make loads of different points about how they're dealing with the idea of parenting, and ideally every point that you start your paragraph off with would be either a comparison or a contrast. So the third one, a little bit harder, you'll notice there's kind of more keywords to that one, and they're a bit more densely kind of compacted, which is why this is the type of thing you'd get at A-level or university level. You have the name of the book, so it focuses on the book. You have this word criticism, which means that it's trying to point out kind of difficulties or problems with something, like limitations with something. Criticism can also be positive, but in this case it's kind of used negatively. Male patriarchy is your focus. And to what extent actually means it's an argumentative essay. So you need to present your side of the argument. You need to develop an argument and then argue from your position the whole way through that essay. So to what extent questions, you will get those at GCSE as well, and in the lower levels. So the keywords, they help you identify if a question is discursive, comparative, or argumentative. They also help you stay focused on what the question is actually about. You have to bear in mind that the point of an essay is to answer the question. It's not to just show everything you know on a topic. So if you know loads of stuff and you're kind of just spitting all of that out on a page, it's not going to get you the most perfect marks because you're not focused enough on the question. So the first thing for writing a perfect essay, fully understanding the question and addressing every single keyword in your answer and making sure that your structure matches the type of essay that you're writing there. So I'm going to just do a little breakdown now of the kind of main categories or main aspects of an essay, like the main sections, I guess. And I'll just really briefly go into what these are. So once you've figured out exactly what your question is and how to kind of pick apart that, like you've thought about your ideas to do with your answer, what you do is you plan your intro and your middle paragraphs. You don't need to plan a conclusion, but it's important to know what a conclusion is and what you can and can't do in a conclusion, so I'm going to include that as well in this video. So firstly, the introduction. You need to introduce, sorry, I can't type today. You need to introduce your ideas on the question. You don't introduce the text, don't tell the story, don't talk about what happens. Just break down the question. Think about your different ideas to do the question. If argumentative, so if it's a to what extent or how far do you agree type question, introduce both sides of the argument. If it's comparative, focus equally on both texts in your introduction. So introduce your ideas to the question on the first one and then on the second one. So like compare the way in which two sources present ideas about parenting. Your first sentence would be source A presents ideas about parenting in this way. Your second would be source B presents ideas about parenting in that way. And then your third point would be a comparison of those two. So we've got an introduction that introduces the ideas on the question. If it's argumentative, introduces both sides of the argument. You can include context and critical ideas. You don't have to. Critical ideas are like theories. Again, you can use those A level and above, so don't worry about those at GCSE, but you can include context in your intro at GCSE, as long as it's relevant to the question and relevant to the point that you're making at the time. You don't want to go into the whole history of how the book was written or who the writer is or what the book's about or what the poem is, that kind of thing. Way too much detail. So the introduction introduces your ideas about the question. It doesn't just introduce the book or anything like that. The last sentence of the intro needs to be a thesis, and this is really important for anything above a B grade at any level. So a thesis is a one-sentence answer to the question that is as fully developed as possible. Generally, we would go into what the writer makes us think, feel, or realize about the focus of the question, about the focal point of the question. For example, if I took that first one, in what ways does the writer explore the idea of growing up? I might say for my thesis, the writer makes us realize that all people's sorry, I've just drawn a blank with my head, hang on. So something like the writer makes us feel that everybody has their own experience of growing up and people can have very different responses to maturity, or people mature at different rates. It depends on what actually the text is, but you could make a point like that. Or the writer makes us appreciate our childhood and when we're young, because we realize that growing up isn't all that fun, and when you're an adult you've got to be serious. So depending on what the writer is actually doing, your thesis would change, but you need a thesis that ties, kind of just answers your question, and it ties all of your middle paragraphs together as well. So it's a one-sentence answer. You develop it as much as possible. If it's argumentative, you would state whether you agree or disagree in your thesis, and then you carry on to your middle paragraphs. So your middle paragraph, sometimes this is also called the main body. So you might have heard it being called the main body. These make up the bulk of your essay. You need a minimum 3 for it to be a proper essay. 2 is not enough to fully explore a question. There's no real maximum, but the maximum depends on your word count or your time limit, that kind of thing. You're best off having not so many middle paragraphs and making sure that they're really long. So don't write loads of short middle paragraphs, write kind of like big chunks each time you write one. Maybe 2/3 of a page long, roughly, if you're handwriting, or even if you're typing, about 2/3, about half to 2/3 of a page is a good length for a paragraph. Each paragraph has to begin with a topic sentence. That means it's a single sentence that answers part of your question. If I took that thesis that I was going on about to do with making us appreciate being young and cherishing the times we have when we're teenagers or when we're children, because we grow up too fast. And one point might be about cherishing the times we have as a as a child, and another topic sentence might be about growing up too quickly. So you can split your thesis down into smaller aspects, and those aspects become your middle paragraphs. But you don't want to start with a reference to the text. You don't want to start with like a quotation of the text. You don't want to start with describing what happens in the text. So your topic sentence is your own idea that's answering part of the question, and that has to be the first point that you make in every paragraph. So when we do point, evidence, explanation, you might have heard of this. The point is a topic sentence that answers part of the question. It's not a reference to what happens in the story. So your middle paragraphs ideally are PEE paragraphs with a link to the thesis at the end of each paragraph. So usually, this is where people go wrong with essays. They got too many ideas, they pack like 5 ideas into a paragraph and nothing's fully explored. Or they might give loads of evidence with no points, or they might give point evidence without any explanation. So make sure you can do point evidence explanation. I'll make another video going into that in more detail and explaining how to do that. And make sure you can link back at the end of every paragraph to your thesis. So that creates like a loop, basically. So you go back and forth from the thesis to exploring one dimension of the thesis, back to the thesis at the end of the paragraph, and then into another point, doing the same. So you're basically constantly going back and forwards between individual points and then your overall argument, which is outlined at the end of your intro in your thesis. So finally then, a conclusion. It just summarizes all the main points again. And it reiterates, not repeats exactly, don't do it word for word, but it just reiterates the thesis. Oh, apparently reiterates is not spelled that way. Yeah, so you just don't like repeat word for word, but just kind of like echo your thesis. So yeah, that's like mostly what you need to know for writing a perfect essay. If you start out with all of those and just try and aim towards that in your essays, you'll notice that your grades start improving. Then you might want to do things like go back and learn your themes in more detail, or work more on doing PE paragraphs so that they're stronger, that kind of thing, or focus on terminology. But the first thing you want to do with any essay is get your basic structure right and understand the focus. So that was kind of the aim of this lesson. So hopefully you're feeling a little bit more confident about that all now, and you're ready to start putting some of this into practice with your essays. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you guys soon.